Today we're going to talk about the Dynamo Roller in Salmon Run. Before we start, this video will be slightly longer due to the nature of the weapon. There's a lot to cover with the Dynamo and I will do my best to cover as much as I feel is important. No doubt some stuff will be missed, otherwise the video will be like an hour long. Like most of my other videos, I might leave out strategies for overfishing to prioritise the general advice that is beneficial to everybody. Ready? Let's go. Number 1. The Dynamo Roller is a heavyweight roller that is both the strongest roller in terms of damage, but also the slowest roller in terms of movement and ink recovery. It is incredibly unique in Salmon Run and has no point of reference or comparison to any other weapon in the game. For this reason, it's important to recognise that playing this weapon like other rollers will not end up well. You need to learn this weapon separately and not use this weapon like you would use anything else. Number 2. Just in case you didn't know this by now, in Salmon Run, the most optimal way to use rollers most of the time is to roll with them, as opposed to PvP where you'll just get sniped out of existence if you do. This is the most ink-efficient and optimal way to damage the majority of enemies in Salmon Run. With some rollers, such as the Carbon, you'll switch between flicking and rolling depending on what you need to achieve, so the rule of always rolling isn't as strict. However, unlike all other rollers, this is the way you want to use Dynamo about 90% of the time. I'll speak more about when to deviate from rolling a bit later on, but for now it's worth talking about why you always want to prioritise rolling the Dynamo versus flicking. The Dynamo does 400 damage to anything it comes into contact with when in rolling form. This is objectively one of the most powerful weapons in the game, with the only other weapons coming close to this in terms of damage being the Tenterbrella, the Tri-Stringer and the E-Liter, all of which I have already made videos about, by the way. In terms of DPS, damage per second, you can argue about which weapons are more powerful, but in terms of just raw damage numbers, at 400 damage at the point of contact, this makes the Dynamo extremely powerful. You can essentially crush all enemies you roll into that don't have armour, but more on that in the next chapter. After rolling for 1.5 seconds, the Dynamo will start to dash, which is the maximum speed you can go whilst rolling. In terms of flicking, horizontal flicks do a maximum of 200 damage, and vertical flicks do a maximum of 300 damage. Vertical flicks are also much more reliable when aiming at targets, as the horizontal flicks have an awkward hitbox that can cause targets to be missed completely or only take reduced damage. For these two reasons, vertical flicks are more beneficial for you to use if you need to direct an attack at something. Another reason you want to prioritise rolling over flicking with the Dynamo is because of its punishing ink tank and slow ink recovery rate. You only get a limited amount of flicks out of a Dynamo before running out of ink, and that decreases drastically when you throw a bomb or an egg. In addition to that, ink recovers a lot faster when coming out of rolling form versus after flicking. I've spoken about this in my Carbon video in much more depth, but as is the same with all rollers, if you aim your camera down and move in towards your target after attacking, you will inflict more damage more quickly. Check out the Carbon video for more information about this. I don't often talk about patch notes as I feel like they don't drastically change a weapon, but in May 2023, patch 4.0 was released and it was a pretty huge deal for the Dynamo in Salmon Run as it saw it get two major buffs. The amount of ink consumed by both horizontal and vertical flicks was reduced by 25%, but more importantly, the amount of ink consumed when holding ZR to paint whilst moving forward was reduced by 33%. This made such a huge difference in ink management that going forward, you now have more leniency with both flicking and rolling, which can make the roller feel slightly easier to manage. Whether this will change in the future is unknown, but it's worth mentioning as it's made the Dynamo feel a lot more comfortable to use in terms of ink management. Number 3. The Dynamo's uniqueness makes some enemies very easy to manage and others quite tricky. Let's go through them one by one as I think it's important to show how to manage all of the enemies you'll encounter. For steelheads, you always, and I truly mean always, want to vertical flick to attack them as it's a one-shot kill. Do not neglect these bosses and do not waste time horizontally flicking at them. One vertical flick is all you need. For Moors, throwing a bomb is more often than not the best way to deal with them. But as they have 1200 HP, they just need 3 hits from a Dynamo in rolling form. This means that if you time it right, you can defeat Moors when they activate either from above it or next to it. I often choose to throw bombs as it's a one and done thing, but don't fret if you get caught in a Morse's mouth whilst rolling. Just aim your roller down and you can escape and potentially defeat it in the process. For scrappers, their armour has 600 HP, whilst their exposed driver has 500 HP. This means it takes 2 hits to stun them whilst rolling and 2 hits to kill them. This can be slow, and if there's 3 of them on you, you can feel like you're in a pinball machine. Make sure you're in a safe position to do this, and take care not to get bounced off by the harsh knockback of this weapon against the scrappers. For steel eels, their exposed tails are 500 HP, which means it takes 2 hits from a rolling dynamo to be defeated. The driver of the eel is one of the few enemies in the games that don't directly damage you or knock you back. This speeds up the process of defeating eels quickly. This is the same for any weapon that is able to crush enemies, all rollers and brushes, but is undeniably something that is extremely beneficial to the dynamo as it speeds up a process that could potentially take longer. Salmon lids also have 500 HP, which means it's a minimum of 2 hits if you're rolling against the exposed enemy, or if you choose to vertically flick then roll. You're probably scared of stingers as a dynamo, and rightly so. We've all been traumatised by them in some way. One of the nicest changes that happened between Splatoon 2 and Splatoon 3 in Salmon Run was that all rollers can now use their rolling form to take out stinger pots one by one without needing to repeatedly flick at them. Of course, as a dynamo, they shouldn't be your priority, but when you're in freelance, you kind of have to do whatever you need to do to survive. I often find rolling in a circle around the pots is more consistent. However, if you're on a ledge or a hill, they will just take damage from the incline. You will always need to tilt your camera up for the last pot. For flipper floppers, you can combine a horizontal flick and rolling afterwards to quickly paint the area affected. You might struggle with this though if there are other factors hindering this, such as missiles or rain. Another alternative is crushing the enemy whilst it is underground and about to leap into the air. At 1200 HP, it takes 3 hits from a rolling dynamo. This is often the more efficient way to deal with them if you lack paint or you're already rolling to crush other enemies. Drizzlers are a problematic boss for the dynamo as the tech to easily defeat them was patched out, unfortunately. For this reason, it may prove easier to shoot torpedoes back wherever possible. Another way to defeat them is when you know the landing point that they are moving to. At 900 HP, they take 3 hits from a rolling dynamo, so positioning yourself in its landing spot when it's exposed and landing is the quickest method to defeating them. The Drizzler attacks twice before it jumps to a different spot, so if you know a Drizzler is about to move away from you, then timing a vertical flick into a roll just before it jumps is another efficient way of defeating them, as there is a short window where they will take damage after firing their second attack and before they jump. Big shots are very easy to deal with as a dynamo. At 1200 HP, they take 3 hits from a rolling dynamo to be fully defeated. I often make sure to wait until they're headed back to the cannon before I attack them because they don't attack you directly or knock you back, meaning your dynamo effortlessly damages them as the big shots push against you. Fish sticks can prove to be a problematic time waste if you're the person left with the task of defeating them. A vertical flick paints the entire stick and you're able to do 3 to 4 horizontal flicks to defeat them from the top of the stick, but ideally, you'd rather a teammate take care of them where possible. You're also able to hit them from the ground or elevated platforms, but again, not ideal to be the player having to defeat them. For flyfish, it can be hit and miss whether you'll struggle against them. Having lots of them on a map will prove difficult, so even though the dynamo's ink tank doesn't like bomb throwing, you will be forced to deal with them at some point. You'll need to avoid missiles putting damage on you as you're slow in movement, so don't neglect these bosses just because you're not the best suited to deal with them. I'll talk about night waves in a separate point, but lastly, let's talk about the lessers. The dynamo crushes all lessers in a single hit, even cohorts. One of the most important roles to recognise with the dynamo is that you will undeniably be the best person to take care of lessers, almost above every other weapon. Yes, I've told you how to defeat all the bosses, but that doesn't mean that you're suited to do this all the time. The dynamo is surprisingly adaptable in a lot of comps, and one of the best uses for it is literally cleaning up all the lessers around you. Don't be that teammate that contends for flyfish kills when you're stood next to a junior player who can do this much quicker than you. Instead, clear the lessers for them to make it safe. More often than not, lessers are neglected for the big shiny boss kills, but if you want a hope in hell of ever maintaining rank at HLM, you'll need to recognise that lessers are the true final boss in this game, and ignoring them will be a permanent blockade that stops you from progressing. Number 4. You're probably thinking, oh, you make it sound so easy, the ink efficiency sucks on this weapon. Well, you're right, it does. It's extremely punishing if you're unprepared or unsure how to deal with it. One of the ways I play this weapon is to make sure I only ever flick when I know I will be following it up with a roll. It's a patient style of playing with targeted attacks and a view to make sure I don't end up stuck in a situation I can't control. In most circumstances, you'll want to make sure that whatever is in front of you can be crushed or stunned and that you can effectively clear an area with the flick, then the roll. Repeatedly flicking with the dynamo will cause the ink to rapidly decrease, and you may find you don't have a safe escape or a plan to retreat if you're low on ink. The reason you want to roll is because you can manage the ink refill better in roll form than you can if you're flicking. If you're rolling and running low on ink, standing still and waiting for a second or two without releasing the ZR button will start to replenish ink. You'll never want to release and start flicking or flailing, as this won't recover ink and you'll likely take damage from whatever is near you. Remember, the dynamo can put 400 damage on anything it touches, so even just having a sliver of ink left in your tank whilst rolling may be enough to create a safe area around you. Another thing to quickly mention here is that standing still with the roller down and not moving won't inflict damage on the enemies approaching it. You'll need to slightly move towards the enemies to put damage on them. Even just the smallest movement of the control stick will inflict damage, meaning you can push forward to clear an area, then stop to regain ink. It's quite difficult to explain all of this, and it's one of those things that comes with time and experience when using this weapon. You'll eventually improve the more you play. Number 5. For the dynamo, most night waves are easy to manage with a couple of notable exceptions. Gorillas can prove extremely tricky if you're unable to keep up pace with the bosses and the small fry. The dynamo can do 2 jobs here: small fry control or roll the gorillas. Rolling the gorillas is possible when you're able to use elevated platforms against them. Spawning grounds and Gone Fishing are the 2 easiest maps to do this on, but it's possible wherever you're able to get the dynamo to roll against the exposed tail. Gorillas take 400 damage to stun them, so either 1 hit with a roll or 2 flicks. Hopefully your teammates will be helping to stun them or damage them, so look to see what needs doing, either rolling all the small fry or damaging the gorillas. Mothership can feel limiting when you're given a dynamo. This is probably the one time that I choose to use horizontal flicks over vertical flicks. The reason for this is because the Chinooks only have 50 HP and the wide area covered by a horizontal flick will hit more of them at once as opposed to just vertically flicking one at a time. It feels more efficient to do it this way, however this is just the way I generally play it. Other people may find different ways to efficiently use this weapon here. For the ship itself, vertical flicks are more effective at putting damage on it, but more often than not I usually help with managing lessers if my teammates are all firing at the ship. For Fog and Tornado, there isn't much to say that I haven't already covered. Keep lessers controlled and watch out for multiple Cohocks falling on your heads. During Cohock charge, you can opt to take a cannon as this will kill most of the enemies a lot quicker and ink is easier to manage. However, given that you're able to crush Cohocks very quickly, it might prove feasible to be the person out of the cannon around basket, controlling the area and running eggs. It's entirely up to the comp, map and spawns, but the adaptability is there. For Mudmouse, I often take the role of controlling lessers to allow my teammates to safely throw bombs. This becomes very helpful against golden Mudmouse that spawn Cohocks instead of small fry or chum. Once defeated, you can throw some eggs and help your teammates with the next spawns. During Goldie Seek, you'll need to be the person that damages the Goldie as much as possible. The Goldie doesn't attack or inflict damage, and if you set yourself up so that the Goldie is running into you, you can inflict enormous damage on it, quickly defeating it. Be mindful of bounce back and the path of the Goldie switching, however. This can cause you to get knocked off your rolling path. You also need to move against the Goldie whilst allowing it to push you, taking care to switch left or right with its path. For Glowflies or Rush, you will do most of the work crushing the chum and Goldies. Hopefully your teammates will stay in one place and you can stand directly in front of them to crush everything that comes towards you. I'd encourage you to ignore the temptation to run eggs, as hopefully those who don't have the aggro on them will fulfill this objective. When you have your roller down and you're holding ZR, you'll need to keep an eye on your ink tank to ensure you don't run out. Try not to roll forward with too much speed, as this will decrease your ink tank quickly. Instead, stay still and slightly tilt the stick forward ever so slightly. Whenever you have a moment of downtime with no chum heading towards you, instead of releasing the ZR button, simply stand still to start refilling your ink tank to ensure you'll be ready for whenever they start coming back towards you. It's easier said than done, and I know in freelance anything goes, but do your best not to die, as the potential to snowball and lose can happen very quickly. As always, if things look a bit wild and scary, use a special to assist with killing, staying alive, and of course, giving you a quick ink tank refill. There is a lot, honestly so much I haven't covered here, and it was really tricky trying to work out what I should talk about. I haven't spoken about the extra wave kings or what role you should be taking as the Dynamo in general. There's also a bunch of weird and wonderful things that you can do with this weapon that I've neglected in favour of much more basic information. But I hope the stuff I've covered gives you a bit more of an understanding how to get the most out of this weapon. And I hope it helps you appreciate the Dynamo a bit more too. Let me know what you think. I will see you soon. That's alright, we did it anyway. I'm gonna die to fly fish pee. Got pushed! I died to fly fish pee.